All right, I'm just going to do a very brief one because it seems like I'm preaching to the choir tonight. But basically, I want to talk today about the Democrats and Obama and why we shouldn't support them. Basically what our alternative is, and I guess where to go from here. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the statement by Richard Trumka, who's the president of the AFL-CIO, on basically after saying that they were talking about a totally independent campaign, possibly for this coming election period, whatever that meant, they ended up endorsing Obama. And I wanted to read out the endorsement because it actually talks about a lot of the reasons why people have suddenly jumped on the Obama bandwagon after going so long over the past few years of rejecting him, even among like some of the not so left liberals. So I'm just going to read that out first of all. Richard Trumka says, as president, Barack Obama has placed his faith in America's working men and women to lead our country in economic recovery and our full potential as a nation. With our endorsement today, we affirm our faith in him and pledge to work with him through the election and his second term to restore fairness, security, and shared prosperity. The coming election is about values. President Obama honors the value of hard work, of mutual respect, and of solving problems together. Not every person for himself or herself. He believes that we together we will get through the most he believes that together we will get through the most challenging economic crisis in memory and restore opportunity for all. Each of the Republican presidential candidates, on the other hand, is pledged to uphold the special privileges of Wall Street and the 1%, privileges that have produced historic economic inequalities and drowned out the voices of working people in America. President Obama took America from the brink of a second Great Depression by pressing Congress to pass the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which saved or created 3.6 million jobs. He championed comprehensive health insurance reform, which, while far from perfect, set the nation on a path toward health security that had eluded our country for nearly 100 years. He insisted upon Wall Street reform, passed over the objection of almost every Republican, that is now beginning to reverse decades of financial deregulation that put our entire economy at risk. Although the labor movement has sometimes differed with the president and has often pushed his administration to do more and do it faster, we have never doubted his commitment to working families. He has worked hard to create jobs. He has made the revival of the manufacturing sector a hallmark of his jobs agenda. He has moved aggressively to protect workers' rights, pay, health and safety on the job. He has worked for a fair resolution of the housing crisis, and he put his confidence in administration unequivocally behind the workers and companies in American auto industry, a move that saved hundreds of thousands of jobs and is helping to revive the economy now and for the future. President Obama has earned the support of working people for a second term, and today the AFL-CIO voted proudly and enthusiastically to endorse him for a second term. The labor movement is the original social network, a working-class social network, and this year the unions of the AFL-CIO will be mobilizing working people to come together to organize their neighborhoods door-to-door, powered by cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned energy. We'll be running an independent program rooted not in parties or candidates, but in helping working people build power, making informed decisions about which candidate at each level, at every level, to work for based on records and issues. I think the last part's kind of revealing when he's trying to connect what he said earlier about running an independent campaign with somehow ending up back with the Democrats, which is, it's an old tack. There's actually even some left groups that do it, which is they're going to have an independent program, independent campaign, independent actually of the president, but to get him elected, which doesn't do anything materially different. Essentially the exact same thing. But I wanted to talk about some of these so-called advantages of Obama, or benefits of Obama. Because I think that much of what has happened under the Obama administration that people think might be progressive is largely just spin. One of the first things is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Now, basically what that ended up being was, when they're talking about in this letter about some of the support that was given to working people and creation of jobs, what he's actually saying is that Obama had a massive giveaway to big business. just because you have a created job doesn't mean it's a decent one, and it doesn't mean that it's a job that even benefits you in the United States of America. The reality is a lot of the jobs have continued to go overseas, and we as workers are continuing to compete with other workers in other countries instead of working together against the international capitalist classes of each country. Other parts of that particular agreement were support to the free trade agreement with South Korea and Colombia. And as we all know here, especially in Colombia, anything that happens there with the big bosses involves typically disappearances and open murders of trade union leaders and workers who are trying to have a decent existence. They have deregulated a lot of the EPA's environmental standards. They have, even the Democrats were holding their national convention in a non-union hotel, which is causing, I think it's the hotel workers union to basically boycott the Democrats over that. So this, as far as his creation of jobs, that means nothing. The creation of jobs that we as working people demand is not a creation of jobs at the expense of other working people. It's always a creation of jobs for the benefit of us, regardless of whether it has any kind of blowback on the capitalist class. What Obama instead has done has bailed out these companies which can do whatever the hell they want to at this point with all their money that they've gotten from the government. Another thing we're all talking about now is Obamacare, another thing that I consider largely a hoax. Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is the official name. There was actually a rider that was attached to it that includes some really onerous conditions for students that we may have just recently heard about. That includes getting rid of the waiting period, or the grace period between your graduate and postgraduate, being forced to pay for the interest on those loans in the period after, right after you get your master's degree, or I'm sorry, actually it's the period after your bachelor's, so it would be master's too. So the period after your bachelor's degree, you'll have to be paying for your interest while you're getting your master's degree, and you could even conceivably be paying for the whole thing. I mean, these are all things that are going to cause even a greater and greater disparity, even as the increase in cost for college has increased, I think, in like 100 and something percent over the past decade. There's never been a time when that's been more detrimental to students than now. We actually, more and more, we're reverting back to the way that schooling used to be in the 1800s, when it was the rich people that went to college and the poor people that had no education. So that's something we have to look at as being really incredibly negative, although it was actually passed because there was a slight increase in the Pell Grants and a slight lowering of the interest rates. That somehow was going to make up for it. Actually, it's a much worse situation. I would say something similar with Obamacare in that essentially what it ends up being is just car insurance applied to the health industry. Essentially what's going to end up happening is people are going to be forced to pay for health insurance. Doesn't mean you're going to be going to jail if you don't pay for it. It does mean that, except in very exceptional circumstances, you're going to be either paying for it now or paying for it later, either out of something that if they go through collections or if they go through your tax returns. And it doesn't have any kind of cap on what the insurance companies are going to be charging you. They could charge you anything. It's been a huge bonanza for the insurance companies. It actually came out of a right-wing think tank. I think it's the American Heritage Foundation. So it's interesting to note that this socialist healthcare is nothing different than what we've experienced under the system for the past 150 plus years, which is socialism for the rich, the insurance companies, and the free market for the rest of us. The only real advantage that working people are going to experience out of this healthcare reform is going to be basically that they have to cover preconditions. You have to be able to be insured even if you have a pre-existing condition. Although if insurance companies refuse to, it's going to end up just being a burden on the state. So we're going to end up paying for it out of taxes anyway, since taxation is not especially progressive in this country. So again, another hoax. How this is a step forward, I don't know. Maybe a step forward in the sense that it's the government's involved, but so what? The question is, how does it benefit working people? That's what matters. And for all intents and purposes, this is not going to benefit working people. As far as reform on Wall Street, it's true there have been some reforms. In general, they haven't been even to the point of the reforms that existed, I shouldn't say reforms, the laws that existed under Bill Clinton. So all the reforms that Bush made, or I shouldn't say reforms, all the giveaways to the big banks that happened in Wall Street, that happened in the 2000s, we still haven't gotten back to where we were in the 90s. So just to show you how little the Wall Street reform really ended up being. Aside from that, one of the big things is LGBT, or I should say LGBTQ. There has been a removal of the don't ask, don't tell policy, and I'll go over that in just a minute. But there's also something where Obama said he personally is in favor of gay marriage, or the right to have a marriage if you're gay. Now, as far as what happened in the military, let's keep in mind that was instituted by Bill Clinton. You know, we are still to the right of where we were in the 90s. Bill Clinton established don't ask, don't tell. Actually, I don't know if people were old enough to remember at the time, probably Jacob, but basically back at the time in the 90s, that was an idea, that was a way of getting around discrimination against gays. Now you don't have to say that you're gay, you know. It was actually used as a way of pushing people out massively in the military. And so just removing that, you know, there also has been a removal of the necessity of being straight to be in the military. But I wanted to read this thing that Obama says as far as his personal views on being gay. He says, or in general when it comes to gay marriage, and I want to explain why I think these things have happened. This is an exact quote of what Obama said. As has so often been the case, let's see. At a certain point, I've just concluded that for me personally, it is important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married. That was the whole statement. That's everything. Now, as far as that's concerned, there's no talk of a specific reform that's going to happen. There's no actual law that's going to be on the books based on that. He's just talking about his own opinion, which interestingly happened after polls started swinging in favor of gay rights. So is this something he's going to actually put into law? I mean, it's possible, but the reality is, as of now, it's just rhetoric. It's just a way of getting people to support him in the elections, since it's now become more popular. Now, as far as the military, I would say that is a gain. That is something we move forward on, but I don't think it has anything to do with Obama and his amazing progressiveness. I think this has everything to do with the mass movements for gay rights that have been going on around the country. You know, we've seen things similar to that in the military after World War II, when similar developments were happening among black people demanding equality. So those are the things that Obama has done. We should talk about some of the things that he hasn't done, which are the real fundamental things. I'd say one of the main things that hasn't been done by Obama has been Taft-Hartley. Taft-Hartley is a law that was put into place back in the 50s, and essentially what it represents is several different very onerous conditions on labor. We can't have fully closed shops because of Taft-Hartley. Managers are not protected if they want to support a union drive because of Taft-Hartley. You can't have whole industry-wide union campaigns because of Taft-Hartley. Obviously, we can still do all these things, but it's not legal, and it can cause massive fines on unions. And so it's been a huge burden on the union movement since its institution. That's the main thing, above all, that labor demands and that needs to be taken care of by anyone who claims to be even remotely a labor proponent. Let's see, another thing is no pullout of Afghanistan and an increase in drone attacks on Pakistan, increased intervention in countries like Syria and Libya. Intervention throughout the world has increased. More people have been killed by drone attacks under Obama than under George Bush by far. So that hasn't slowed down at all. There was a pullout about Iraq, but had nothing to do with him. It had everything to do with the United States being incapable of controlling the situation in Iraq and causing more damage than good as far as their profit interests. And it didn't actually happen until there was a ratification of a treaty that would have allowed them to try soldiers, prevent the trying of soldiers in Iraq that committed war crimes against Iraqi people. So at that moment, when they refused to ratify that, they began to pull out. It should be noted they still have troops on the ground in Iraq. They still have the largest base in the world in Iraq, with the so-called U.S. Embassy, largest embassy ever in the history of America. So there's other things. No closing down of the torture centers that were supposed to be taken down as one of his campaign promises. EFCA wasn't instituted. EFCA is the Employee Free Choice Act. Essentially, what it does is allows workers that want to organize in any place. So all they have to do is sign, I think it's 51% union cards in favor of a union. They don't have to hold an election, and they can have a union instituted in that company. This is something that he also said he was going to do, that unions were initially very disillusioned with him because he couldn't even pass that, which is actually how standard practice of unions had been for most of the 20th century, even if it hadn't been in law. So, obviously the question is, Obama is clearly not the best candidate, but does that mean he's not worth voting for, or not maybe like a step in the right direction? I would say working people need to have their own voice. They need to have a party that represents them. And the reason why is because we can't push or pull Obama any more than we can push or pull anybody else as far as the capitalist representatives. It doesn't really matter whether we're going to have a Republican in office or a Democrat in office. If we have a mass movement, they're going to move to the left or the right based on their needs. I think the dictum of Lenin, which is reform is always a byproduct of the revolutionary movement, is really applicable here, because that's exactly why we're going to get reforms, is because they're afraid of something deeper going into effect than what's already being presented. They'll provide something that's going to let off some of the steam from the building like pressure cooker of being a working person. So aside from that, I would say the Democrats, one of the reasons why we can't use them is because they are directly tied to the bosses, and that's through a number of methods. One of the main ones is donations, especially now with super PACs. There is a very close noose around all of these candidates when it comes to the funding for donations. The only way you're going to get donations is if you represent the interests of the capitalist class, and they're the ones who provide that funding for election campaigns. Aside from that, they're the ones who are able to create jobs. They're the ones that hold the purse strings when it comes to bonds, purchasing government bonds. Basically, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are both completely tied into that system. In order for us to actually utilize the Democrats as a workers' party, we would have to clear out the Democrats and start over from scratch. So what I propose is that instead of doing that, we build a new party. And this is something that a lot of smaller independent unions have been calling for. There's actually a Labor Party remnant from the old Labor Party in the 90s, started by Tony Mazzocchi in North and South Carolina. They attempted to run a candidate last election. and we need to push for that, for that to have a greater impact. As a socialist, I don't think that that's enough of an answer. I think that that's just the beginning. I think that that is a way for working people to begin the process of political organization, to move toward a more fundamental change in the system. And actually, I prefer to have just a labor party that's, frankly, a socialist party, a socialist labor party with a mass base tied to the unions. It's probably unlikely, if that were to happen tomorrow, that would be the case, given the nature of the leadership of the unions. But I think that's one of the key things that socialists and revolutionaries should be pushing for, is for a party representing working people. Just as we have unions that represent the economic interests, we need a party that represents the political interests of working people. Aside from that, the Democrats honestly still lack the wholesale support of the people. They're not like a mass popular party, even now. Even maybe you could say for a very brief period in 2008, they had some mass support because there was a lot of illusions in Obama and what he was going to be able to do, or seeing whatever they wanted to see in him, based on what they wanted. But I would say that that's definitely not the case any longer. The vast majority of the Democratic Party usually polls, and obviously keep in mind that polls are generally, they're always going to be very biased. But in general, I think it's just over 13% now for the Democrats in general in Congress. So I guess the conclusions are, basically we need a mass party of labor, we need a party representing working people, and in order for it to succeed, it's got to be one with a revolutionary socialist program. We need to fight for workers' control and a planned nationalized economy, and for socialist internationalism, and for an end to the competition between workers of different nations. And I think that using our abilities to go into the unions and our ability to put pressure, build mass support for these things, as socialists, we can bring a deeper understanding of things beyond just the pragmatic realities of current capitalist life, but talk about the possibilities of how we can overcome all the contradictions of capitalism with working people, because we have a deeper analysis, we have a more fundamental understanding of the system. That fundamental understanding has been kind of wiped out, especially with the fall of the USSR. So I guess I'll just leave it at that, and open it up to a discussion and see what people have to say.
Yeah, I want to ask your basic take on a more simplistic historical question, which is, say the sort of German reforms that were brought about by the labor movement in the in the mid and late 1800s. This would be the First Reich, where they instituted things like retirement for the first time, and things like labor laws. The Bismarck healthcare system and stuff like that, which of course are largely lauded and still even better than the United States in a lot of ways. How do you think, if we take the proposition true that, and we can generally observe that, groups like the Democrats and even the Republicans will bend their will when they feel like their capitalist hold over the people is potentially in danger? How do you think that mechanism works with persuading mass groups of people, not the labor movement, but like the people that are the workers in those countries and things like that? How do you think that mechanism works in a situation like ours in terms of persuading those people instead of buying into those sort of middle solutions, into just quitting out of that, saying hold your breath, just hold it strategy, and we're going to do that? How do you see that working?
I don't honestly know a whole lot about those laws with Bismarck. I would assume it had a lot to do probably with the revolutions that were going on at the same period, where you have the 1848 revolution in Germany.
If you're more comfortable with a different historical scenario.
Oh, no, and I'll definitely go into that. I was actually going to say, a good example of that in the United States although definitely not to the same extent, is FDR and the New Deal. A lot of the reforms that we got out of the New Deal, there was actually a military coup to overthrow FDR. I didn't even tell you that. I know you know that. But there was a military coup to overthrow him, or a plot to overthrow him. At the very last moment, someone went in and reported the coup, and it was prevented from happening. And I think it was by 3 major capitalists, and they thought that FDR was a communist. The reality is that only happened, as I think you're implying, that only happened because there was fear of something deeper happening, like a revolution. And so that was a way of placating people. I think that in reality, we can push for a deeper, like a revolutionary perspective that can overcome that in that kind of crisis, because it's fleeting, and the reality is it's not permanent. There's no permanence to it, and we can bring those issues out to working people. The reality is, as soon as the crisis is averted, they'll revert back to the way things used to be. I've seen this in union organizing, where the bosses will give very small reforms to working people in the workplace, sometimes not even that great, and workers will totally jump off the union bandwagon to get those reforms. And what ends up happening, they'll take them away as soon as the union movement is gone. The more hardcore will realize that, and actually what I've found is you have to kind of go through the whole process, explain what's going to happen ahead of time, let it happen, and then show that in fact they're going to remove all these reforms, and when they do actually do it, you'll have that hardcore cadre group within the union that's going to press even harder the next time. I think that's the approach that we have to take, especially with pragmatic Americans who are all about, whatever works is what I'll do. When they see that what doesn't work is temporary reforms, I think that they'll be able to make a more revolutionary perspective out of it.
Try once, fail, try again, fail better.
Yeah.
Cool.
What do you think the process of forming a mass party of labor would look like here in the United States?
I mean, it's impossible to say exactly what the process would be like, but it could be a lot like what happened in the 90s. There was a labor party, it was kind of an aborted attempt at a labor party. It was a very reformist labor party led by Tony Mazzocchi, who was a leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. I think that the initial break that happened with him and with a section of the unions is probably what it'll look like in the future. Although the thing with the 90s is it was a different period than now. So it'll have different, more profound and radical effects probably. In the 90s was a period of expansion. And that was because of the destruction of the USSR, opening of markets in China and Southeast Asia, with the special economic zones, etc. That allowed for, and also massive increase in debt. All these things allowed for a massive expansion of capitalism, which led people to be more willing to accept one of the two existing parties, or to at least not push hard enough for another labor party, especially for the labor leadership to break from the Democrats. I think that it may play out in a similar way. I mean, there's no way to predict the future, but it may have far more profound effects if we are going to head into a deeper crisis. It looks like what's going on in Europe with the European Union crisis. It's definitely going to affect everywhere in the world, and it's really just actually repercussions from the previous crisis that we had in 2008. So I think it could be, more than likely, it's going to be some kind of reformist party, but with potential for something much more radical.
And just to follow up, so do you think that I mean, and I don't know, this kind of goes into the strategy of how to organize as well. Do you think that would be something like just a party forming kind of out of nowhere on its own, or like a coalition of leftist groups formed together, or like a branch of disaffected Democrats creating a radical wing or something like that?
I think it's probably going to be out of the labor union leadership, which is maybe like a coalition of them, and I'm talking out of my ass because who knows what's going to happen. But if we're going to look at the past history of new labor formations, it'll probably be a section of the labor leadership that refuses to support the Democrats. Obviously, we're Republicans. A section of activists very hardcore activists, maybe a section just rank and file workers within the unions, and probably a section of disaffected Democrats. So, I mean, but again, it's not the crystal ball. But if we're looking at the history of any labor formation, it seems like those four groups play a massive role in those formations. It's like I'm thinking of the CIO in particular. So,
If somebody else doesn't. Who?
Shoot.
All right. So this being the RSU, the Revolutionary Students Union, I feel compelled to ask the question how you think a whole new generation of wage slavery, a bunch of debt owners moving up out of colleges and things like that, people that are going to be struggling for employment in the first place, and people that, will live in a practically liquidated market of labor and things like that. How do you think that could potentially be turned into a movement, if it is, or if it's worth organizing under those terms of, say, the unemployment and people who are literally in some sort of form of bondage, and I mean that in the literal sense.
mm-hmm.
Do you think it's worth organizing under different terms? Because I know you've been talking about organizing people that already have jobs who are treated shitty. But how do you think unemployed persons or individuals that are saddled by bondage would factor into that, especially since that's an upcoming generation that previous generations didn't have to deal with?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question. I've actually thought about it quite a bit. There's never been this level of labor organization degeneration since the late 1800s. And when I've tried to kind of make historical comparisons, and obviously those are always limited, but I think studying the 1877 railroad uprising, I think it has a lot of repercussions for us today. At that time, there was virtually no unions. They had been annihilated by the Depression of the 70s, of the 1870s. And there was a almost spontaneous uprising. It wasn't really spontaneous, but you could say almost spontaneous uprising, because the union leadership didn't even exist. The actual existing unions were like organizations for the embetterment of the worker, like to get out of alcoholism and to stop abusing their wives and things like that. They actually ended up being the basis of the AFL, because the workers had to go somewhere. So that's the first place they went.
So the temperance movement, basically.
Not exactly. It was it was connected to it. It actually did emerge to a certain extent from the temperance movement. But in general, these organizations that were in the railroad, that became the Railroad Workers Union, they were there was like a closed circle of people that would have they would bear oaths and things like that, and some of them they were just like I said, just dealing with the personal enrichment of a working person. Not necessarily about intemperance, but it may have been connected to it. But the thing is that there was a spontaneous uprising of working people because they had no choice. It came to a point where they were either going to eat and strike or not eat and strike. So it's vice versa. Eat and strike, or not eat, not strike, or not eat and strike. So you may as well strike, right? I mean, you may as well do something about your situation. And I hope it doesn't come to that. I don't think that the current situation, we still have quite a bit more and more numbers and more sophisticated labor organizations now than they had back then, obviously. So I don't think it'll come to that, but I think it will come to that if nothing happens. If there's no massive new CIO type movement in this country. At a certain point, working people have no choice. They have to do something about their situation, because it's only going to grind down worse and worse as the declining rate of profit increases, or as we feel the effects of it as debt collapses.
All right, I have another question. So stepping away perhaps from the old or traditional understanding of organizing around particular shops where people's exploitation happens specifically and primarily around the exploitation of people's labor as treated as a commodity. When you think about the implications of people like Lenin and what he had to say about imperialism replacing that sort of traditional model of exploitation, how do you think organizing the people around different forms of exploitation, i.e. imperialism by the creation of debts and saddling the people with debts, would affect it? As opposed to organizing shops, organizing people who are victims of debt, things like this.
Okay, now I'm understanding what you're saying. All right. Well, first off, I don't agree with the idea that there's not a white working class or a white proletariat. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I think that in the United States of America, even if people are not, even if they have massive amount of debt, or even if they don't work in a factory, I would still include them in the proletariat. So these are still the same people, I think, that will be facing that. And in fact, I think the difference between the white working class or the majority of working class people in this country, regardless of whether they're white or not, compared to the rest of the world, and another thing that's going to be affecting that is what's been affecting that, which is imperialist globalization, which has been doing what Karl Marx talked about, actually subverting the whole model of imperialism that Lenin's been talking about. But not that that in and of itself would prevent revolution in these countries, but it is creating a situation where working people in different advanced quote-unquote countries are becoming more and more alike with countries that have been historically underdeveloped. So that being said, I don't think that, I think it's very possible that the real revolutionary impulse may come from an underdeveloped country, Again, a lot of these underdeveloped countries have developed quite a bit in the past 50 years. But at any rate, I don't think it's just debt. I think that debt is just one of many things that working people in this country have to face. And I think working for a boss, being exploited, is another thing. And you know, as far as that goes, I think that a key way of continuing the process of ending that disparity between the different nations working people is, instead of all competing for the lowest common denominator, creating international unions that can actually raise the standard of living for everyone to the same level, so everyone gets the same conditions and the same wages. So, in my view, working people have to work together internationally if possible, because otherwise they're just going to go somewhere else and exploit somebody else and make you compete for a job. I don't know if that answers your question.
Not really, but I learned a lot from it. How do you feel like, particularly with the news coming from places like Greece and the sort of creation of the Caesar? Is it Caesar? Thank you. But the creation of that and the sort of division, the rise of the Golden Dawn and things like that, which is, for those who are listening over the internet, things like like a pro-fascist party and things like that. Where do you think that the balances of where labor would stand on its own advantages versus the international question in the U.S. working population? Because it's certainly true that there are populations in the United States who aren't oppressed nationalities that are being affected by capitalism. That's definitely true, but the question is when they're faced with the egalitarian prospect of becoming like a worker in Greece, where they're going to stand on that issue, because it seems to me like it's going to be much more on the Golden Dawn side. So how do you see somebody like the sort of white privileged worker, because there definitely are white workers in the United States, where do you think and how do you think we should organize and or recruit those people to actual to international liberation of working class citizens around the world? How do you see that campaign working out?
Yeah, well, I think it's even basic pragmatics of today require it. Like, the reality is, I don't think that there's a practical way, even not even theoretical, not even like, oh, we have to do some pie in the sky. Like, look at how things are going to be great after socialism. Don't go to be a fascist. Like I think actually, like practically, it's impossible for working people. We'll take an example that's not exactly what you're saying, but I feel is very related, like immigration, right? The idea is historically we always say, oh, white workers hate immigrants because they're taking their jabs, you know, and they're destroying their conditions, whatever. They're creating more competition for white workers. The reality is there's been a huge shift in labor unions over the past 20 years in favor of immigrants, of organizing immigrants, because if they don't, the capitalists are going to use them as competition against white workers, you know? So the reality is, even to defend the basic conditions of working people, you say the privilege of white workers, I would say that unions have to extend that privilege to Latino workers. And in fact, when they have an equality of privilege, they can actually fight for a higher privilege for both, you know? And I think that they can pragmatically see this, especially when you have such a highly divided nature of production, where it's not even just everything is being produced in one country here, everything here is being produced here, but you actually have different sections of the division of labor happening in different countries, you know? And many of them historically have been used as for agricultural reasons or like for raw materials and not for manufacturing, that now are part of the manufacturing process, you know, or even have a majority of the manufacturing process in some cases. So I think that the way, if we look at the immigration situation, I think we can see a very big similarity. And actually, there was recently an international union that was created between, it was, I believe, a car union between, I think, Germany and Pakistan and Britain and I think Canada, and one of the, either Canada or America. But I mean, this is because they have no choice. Like at a certain point, your jobs are going to get outsourced. You're going to feel competition unless you have internationalism. You know, that's why I think groups like Golden Dawn actually, and you could go back to the Nazis in any fascist movement. They actually don't typically recruit working people. They typically recruit, in my opinion, petty bourgeois, like the middle classes. They represent a middle class movement, people who are frenzied by the destruction of capitalism. And are switching back and forth between different classes to support, looking for something that represents their interests. And I think Hitler, for example, at Golden Dawn, seems to represent their interests. Obviously, when they come to power, they obliterate the middle class even worse than the previous government. But
that explains the ideological contradictory nature of fascism. That's a great point, Mike.
I would highly recommend Trotsky's work on fascism. I don't think that there's anyone who really understood fascism the way that he did, including Lenin. And normally I'll side with Lenin against Trotsky, but in this case I'm siding with Trotsky against Lenin. And actually Lenin didn't have much of a characterization in general with Mussolini, but it was a very new phenomenon, so.
Also, like an interesting point, it's not less of a question, but like Golden Dawn, like I think I found it very interesting that they lost parliament seats in this last election cycle, right off the heels of winning seats in the one before it. It was kind of like a reaction to the counter-revolution. We see a revolution in Greece, or revolutionary action. You see a counter-revolution and the whip to the counter-revolution, or the whip of the counter-revolution, causing Golden Dawn to lose seats.
Did you have a question?
No.
I have a question from a different field, which is, why not sort of revolutionary defeatism?
In relation to what?
In a relationship to voting for the worst possible candidate.
Oh, like voting for the
yeah,
reaction.
I mean, like you talked a lot about like not voting for Mitt Romney, but even as somebody who attacks Romney from the far left, I'd like to point out, especially to people that want to support Obama, how progressive Romney is on the things that they pretend to care about. And that's not to say that you know, and I don't do that merely just to make them burst a gasket. I actually am serious about it. Like, Obama is not the progressive candidate, which is obviously your whole speech. But you didn't talk about Romney at all, and you know, there's obvious reasons why it seems like that's the case, and I don't mean to imply anything terrible about that. But what I mean is, Why not a sort of revolutionary defeatism where, for instance, you vote for the worst possible candidate, the most pro-capitalist, rapacious capitalist candidate each time, with the impression of inciting the spark, the iskra
Yeah.
of what you're trying to get at?
Well, I think, first off, I don't think you really, that's,
Accelerationism is generally what that's termed as.
yeah,
So,
I think in general when it comes to that, that's a pretty risky endeavor, because the reality is, just because you do something you think is going to be a spark doesn't mean it actually ends up being a spark, and especially if it seems like the communists are actually favoring the right, it can make people very disillusioned with the communists, and say, well, you know, fuck you. If you're going to support Romney, I really am not going to support you, you know. So I think, like an example, I think is like what happened in Tunisia when the guy lit himself on fire. I doubt that he was doing that to set a spark of the revolution, you know. The reality was, I'm sure people have done it before and it's never done anything, you know. But the fact is that that happened to mesh exactly with how everyone else was feeling at that moment and started something, you know. I think that what we need to do with elections is not try to generate the material conditions. I don't think we can do that. I think what we need to do with that, in my opinion, is to try and utilize the elections to bring people toward a revolutionary socialist perspective. And if we can find like a candidate that's broken from the Democrats, that we can utilize to push for like a Labor Party, or to push for revolutionary socialism, or, you know, just education in general about the political system and how worthless it is, we should do that. Like, that's why we supported Cynthia McKinney in the last election, and she's certainly not a revolutionary socialist. But there was especially black working people who were grouping around her, especially because she was nominated at the same time by a party that ended up not existing, the Reconstruction Party in the Gulf states, which was, it had real implications. It could have been something had it survived. And so I guess that's my view on elections, is we utilize it for propaganda, and if we utilize it to try and generate the spark or the whip of the counter-revolution, as Marx might have said, I think it's going to backfire, and I think it's just a very dangerous proposition. All right, how about one more question and then we'll finish? Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So, if we're a big fan of the strategy of creating a sort of international solidarity, an international congress of some sort, how would you feel the proposition in countries where revolution is a very real proposition as a result of American imperialism and things like that, actually taking orders from those countries to accelerate the rapacious nature of capitalism in order to make it collapse in this country? Like, I understand this is like a way out there what if solution, but this is really how we test the borders of our theories. I mean, it seems to me like that could be a very realistic possibility. I mean, here in the United States, obviously, it would seem like we should work from the other direction rather than this sort of direction. Not because we think that things are going to turn out well for the American worker, but if we're willing to take marching orders from other countries where revolution is already occurring, at least to some extent, or you would say that the actual conditions are real for it, would we be willing to, in a form of a national congress, take orders for an accelerationist approach here in the United States?
Okay, as far as taking marching orders, I think in general that's probably bad strategy overall. I think working people in general have to come together, make democratic decisions, not for any fetish of democracy, but just because we need to come up with the right decision that represents working people's ideas and interests that will benefit them. As far as let me just say something else. As far as like the Russian Revolution, I think that was a good example of everyone basically taking orders. Like, they didn't really, like, there was still a democratic discussion, but the fact is they had state power, you know. So even though they were not in like an advanced capitalist country, it didn't matter. They still were like the head of the international communist movement, you know. But as far as that goes, you're saying, like, should we do something like throw a monkey wrench in, like voting for Mitt Romney as part of the approach of defending or pushing for a deeper revolution in another country, or supporting that revolution? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, like the idea is that capitalism, by its very nature, could create crises
Mm-hmm.
that will affect other countries in a very realistic way, which will strengthen their revolution, but also potentially set it off in other places, like for instance Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Could Greece have happened without our American crisis? I mean, we know that capitalism creates crises every year or something like that, but that doesn't mean that we can't instigate it, right? And it's obviously the case that, or at least it seems obvious, that the revolution is not going to start here. But it could start here if we, instigate it on this side. Yeah, I mean, and this thing is like, it will, in a certain sense, create crises in those countries that could instigate it. And I'm not saying that's the case, or I'm not saying that's my position. I'm saying, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think there's any hard and fast rules. Like, I think if there's something you could actually achieve, if you have like a specific situation, maybe you would do it. I would say in general, it's a bad idea, and we need to have an international working class strategy that involves all working people to everyone's benefit. But it depends. I think it does depend. But I think in general, we've got to keep our banner clean and always be truthful with the working class. The biggest danger of all is losing the trust of working people, especially if we ever manage to have any kind of mass base, which we certainly don't now. That's when it becomes very dangerous. When we actually have the ability to affect something like that, lying to working people to get them to...
Oh, we won't lie with them.
We would have them actively vote for Mitt Romney. And again, we'd have to look at the situation. But I would say you're probably going to be alienating whatever mass base you have with the rest of working people that are not part of the party. But I don't know. Again, we have to look at the concrete situation. Obviously, it's like a far-off idea. But I do want to say I don't think Marxism has any like strong categorical like principles that can never be broken. We have to look at the concrete situation always. In general, I'd say probably going to backfire. I'd stay away from it.